So the idea of globalization turns out to have a lot of pretty ambivalent aspects in terms of what we can make global and what should be global, and perhaps what has been made global over the years as people have figured out different ways to become adapted to this technological world that they are living with. But it certainly seems like, in terms of it being a global phenomenon, we are running pretty short of the number of people that have or do not have access to the internet, the number of people who do or do not have access to technology, and the way that this is impacting people some way or another. But it is true that, to a certain extent, at this point in time, we have an aspect of a global consciousness that people are all the way around us, and that, to even larger extent, using digital technology, we have access to everyone at all times. And there is this pretty controversial downside to it, being that if we have access to people at all times, then whether or not we want it, whether or not we choose to be connected with others, we may be connected through somebody, by a few degrees of separation. We may be appearing into somebody's vicinity who is connected with us. And so we might be the quote unquote accidents in somebody's online presence if we just so happen to share the same space. And that is something that most people, at least everyone that I know and most people that I've ever talked to, um, feel pretty unsure about the fact that this technology that is growing and constantly growing is kind of roping people into it, whether or not we want it. And that is partly due to the fact that the social media platforms kind of make it more or less possible and easy for others to be roped into their systems. This is a principle that became known as frictionless sharing because, according to the kind of normal or natural practices that you have on these social media platforms, you may end up sharing data, whether it is sharing your mood, sharing your pictures, sharing your words, whatever it is. These social media platforms make it very easy for you to put information out there, whatever it might be. And it can come in the form of the things that you share intentionally and the things that those platforms share for you, perhaps the things that those platforms accumulate for you in terms of data. And the frictionless sharing part here of the information is not always clear about exactly who is sharing what and when and how those things are happening. In other words, you may be making some conscious decisions about what you are doing, but the media platforms are making more decisions about what you should be doing. And there is a science to that, of course. This is something that has been designed. It's not an accident. This is something that social media platforms essentially run on. And whether or not people are, again, connected to these media platforms, they may be connected to somebody who is connected to that media platform. Again, they may be sharing a space, intellectual space or digital space with them. And as a result of that, we become connected through other people. And in that context, you are connected through technology as much as you are connected through the old way to be connected, that you know somebody who knows somebody, you have a friend who knows another friend. And again, here we could be talking about this old system, as McLuhan pointed out, of the global village. If you have an idea of a village existence, it mostly has to do with the fact that everybody knows everybody within the village, and that it is very hard to keep any sense of anonymity in a village where everybody knows you, or everybody knows your parents, or everybody knows how you are related to somebody, if you're somebody's cousin, or if you went to school with somebody else. In that sense, of course, we could think of the global village as we are living it, through people being connected through several degrees of separation. And whether or not those degrees of separation are artificially created particularly doesn't matter, because people sometimes make conscious decisions about the things they share. Sometimes they make unconscious decisions about the things they share. Somebody happened to you at some point in the public space and everybody knows about it. So, expanding a network in that context may be done both in a conscious manner and an unconscious manner. And the digital technologies have just made this system a little bit more traceable than it used to be. And it leads us to a question of privacy here, because if all of this data can be retained somewhere or can be written down into some place, then the aspect of privacy becomes a lot more complex than somebody remembering the crazy thing that you did in high school, or somebody knowing you from your cousin or some kind of distant relationship. Because now we have this information stored in places and databases, and privacy in this context is kind of going through a sort of a renaissance now that we've figured out that maybe we should be controlling these databases. We should be making these decisions about our databases on a much larger level than what the corporations who run the databases share, or what the servers on which those databases are hosted control. And there's a whole legal argument behind that, of course, because different countries have different privacy laws, different people have different privacy choices, and different corporations have different privacy policies, which means that it becomes very difficult to know exactly how privacy is working. As this book implies here, the death of privacy in the 21st century, because it seems like inevitable that people may have a shared sense of privacy anymore. Not only because, of course, of all the ways in which privacy can be intruded upon, but also because of the fact that even if you make a lot of efforts to to remain private, somebody else may make the decision for you, which will make all of your choices and all of your measures pretty much useless. And we get back to Foucault here, who was telling us about these ideas of transparencies and privacy in terms of how people are able to connect or unable to connect. This is from a different lecture than the ones that I've quoted before, but he was mentioning, especially the in the prison system, how the privacy devices exist within prisons for the fact that, yes, you have a somewhat of a right to privacy, in as much as you have some private stuff that is yours and yours only in a personal matter, but also because you are living in that system, there are also a lot of expectations of privacies that disappear. For example, about the use of private facilities, or maybe about every other activity that you do in your daily life. And of course, that is by design, according to Foucault. Each individual in his place is securely confined to a cell from which he is seen from the front by the supervisor, but the side walls prevent him from coming into contact with his companions. He is seen, but he does not see. He is the object of information, never a subject in communication. The arrangement of his room, opposite the central tower, imposes on him an axial visibility. But the divisions of the ring, those separated cells, imply a lateral invisibility, and this invisibility is a guarantee of order. If the inmates are convicts, there is no danger of a plot, an attempt to collective escape, the planning of new crimes for the future, bad reciprocal influences. If they are patients, there is no danger of contagion. If they are madmen, there is no risk of the committing of violence upon one another. If they are school children, there is no copying, no noise, no chatter, no waste of time. If they are workers, there are no disorders, no theft, no coalitions, none of the distractions that slow down the rate of work, make it less perfect, and cause accidents. The crowd, a compact mass, a locus of multiple exchanges, individualities merging together, a collective effect, is abolished and replaced by a collection of separated individualities. From the point of view of the guardian, it is replaced by a multiplicity that can be numbered and supervised. From the point of view of the inmates, by a sequestered and observed solitude. So there is this aspect here of this mass that is existing, of course, that exists and that will always exist as people are massed into certain places, but also a mass that is very segmented and very regimented through the devices of technology. Here, of course, the prison technology, but you could expand that to the way in which digital technology is also identifying everyone by specific numbers, by specific codes, and each one of those is working to its own pace that is very individualized in that sense. So again, kind of breaking the space that exists on the internet to those very tiny little boxes, which in a way is the weird goal of privacy, right? Everyone is separated from one another, and no one has the possibility to share a nefarious plan or to share information that could be used in for to upset the system. And of course, this is the opposite of what we are talking about here. Essentially, we are talking about a system of privacy that is imposed to avoid these things in particular. And in that context, seems like privacy is instrumentalized. It is technologically motivated to essentially prevent the people to unite to prevent the system from being destroyed from the inside by the people who are using it. So, in a way, privacy is not necessarily the answer because privacy is something that can be used just like the other principles that can be used against you if you are not being careful about them. People moving individually will surely be less dangerous than people moving as a mass against a larger political system. And the other aspect to that is what has been known more increasingly in the data world as transparency. Because the idea behind this is that if the system is devised in a transparent manner, in other words, if you know exactly what the system looks like, then there's no nefarious plan to be had by anyone, that everyone is visible to everyone. So therefore, everyone is aware of what everyone else is doing, and that in itself is supposed to maintain a measure of order. So those companies will tend to, as Dr. Evil says here, value transparency and open communication because they tell you exactly what they are doing to you. They give you these very long and almost illegible paragraphs of data about exactly what kind of data they are keeping about you. And you are supposed to know the jargon, you are supposed to understand what it means, and you are supposed to get into it of your own accord because you are getting some kind of benefit from it. Now, the downside of this is that people, as a result of these discourses about value, transparency, and open communication, tend to think that it becomes your own responsibility, for example, to be on the internet or to not be on the internet. That, again, if you choose to engage in those platforms, then you choose to be part of this public space in which anything goes or everything goes. But as we just mentioned, that is not the case. You could be very easily roped into this by somebody else. And eventually, the goal is that you, by these discourses, are essentially guilty of being in public, of being around other people. This is your fault for being in a social space with social people, and nobody else's fault, of course, because everybody else is perfect, only you make the mistakes. And certainly, this is not how most of our lives work. Now, in the corporate world, of course, that has turned into much larger legal arguments. For example, when people discovered that when you remove your data from Facebook, some of that data still remains. And there was this lawsuit that was sent by Max Schrems, an Austrian law student who figured out that Facebook was keeping some of its information and started these very lengthy lists of lawsuits to prevent Facebook from keeping any data about you. And the data here has to do with, of course, the name of the person who was there, their profile, and, kind of the page that is created when you're on Facebook. But it also has to do with the incidental reactions to you, the other things that you have done. For example, when you have clicked that you liked something, or when you have tagged yourself in a location. All of that is being kept around on somebody's server somewhere to be used for profit. Of course, it is not used for a particularly nefarious data rather than money making, but it is also something that you did not necessarily choose to be used in that particular respect. So having those systems that are, again, frictionless sharing, where you have not necessarily thought that you were sharing, but that data was still captured, was still appearing in somebody else's database, has created these series of lawsuits and these much larger concerns about how privacy might work in this day and age. So the global aspect to this of everybody's data being everywhere at all times, while the people themselves may no longer be there, is a different aspect of this larger question. That's especially relevant because the data that we are talking about here is kept by corporate systems that are not necessarily themselves transparent. And there have been a movement since the late 90s for most computer software of what is called open source, where when you are doing something, a program or a platform on the internet, there should be a way to look through that open source and see exactly what the software is doing. Now, this is no good for trade secrets, such as the way that Facebook works, such as the way that algorithms work, such as the way that artificial intelligence works. But it is a pretty good system for anyone who is supposed to have any kind of daily life on the internet. No, still, you could have the same argument that I mentioned earlier that if you can have a very lengthy legal disclaimer that tells you exactly what they are doing, then you are supposed to learn law and be able to understand what that means. Here, the principle is the same. If there is this open source, then you would just need to learn computer programming to know exactly how things work. But the larger context is that just like you may not be aware that somebody else is tagging you, you may also be aware that somebody else has looked into that open source, has read those disclaimers, and somebody else can tell you exactly what those documents are saying about you and what those data connection measures are, which means that, again, the transparency aspect is maintained by the fact that somebody somewhere is paying attention. And if you leave enough time for those issues to resolve themselves, then people will be increasingly more aware of how those things are affecting their lives. Now, artificial intelligence here is putting kind of a wrench into this conversation because now we have artificial intelligence models that are able to understand what people are saying, that are able to look at how people's faces are looking. And for example, when you are saying something on the internet, the way that I am doing right now, there is an artificial intelligence system that is writing it down. Those are my words. Those are not the words that I have written, but those are words that could be very easily extracted from the speech that I'm doing now and end up on the internet. Who is owning this data? Is it me, the person who is just speaking right now without having written any of this down, or is it the machine that has designed a system that can write all of this down somewhere? In that case, the line of privacy is very much blurred, and this is something that is, of course, part of today's conversations. One last aspect to all of this is a law that has been, or a rule that has been adopted by the European Union through their General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which is the right to be forgotten. The right to be forgotten appears in the GDPR. It states the data subject shall have the right to obtain from the controller the erasure of personal data concerning him or her with undue delay, and the controller should have the obligation to erase personal data without undue delay if one of a number of conditions apply. Undue delay is considered to be about a month. You must also take reasonable steps to verify the person requesting erasure is actually the data subject. This is especially relevant for people who do not want to be tracked in any kind of way on the internet, and they can make a request and they are legally obligated, according to these rules, to remove that from the internet. And that means that data that is unique to you, including your face, including your recordings, perhaps your voice, perhaps your writings, all of those things, if they have an attachment to your identity, are supposed to be deleted through a request by this system. Now, this is obviously right now a local rule. This is not something that is globally applied, but this is something that could be and probably should be at some point or another adopted on a much larger basis. Because if we are supposed to have some kind of control over our personal data, then that personal data should also be deleted at our own personal request. If we choose the privacy, then this privacy should be honored in some way.